When it comes to inmates working, how are they classified? Prisoners, employees, modern day slaves, or maybe something in between? Insourcing, as prison labor is often called, is a cheap alternative to outsourcing. So instead of sending labor over to China or elsewhere, manufacturers employ over 2 million incarcerated people in the U.S. Joining us now is the editor of Prison Legal News and executive director of the Human Rights Defense Center, Paul Wright. Thanks for coming on with us, Paul. Now, how much are these inmates making in jail?
Generally, they're making very little. And I'd say that there's around 5,000 prisoners who are working for what are called prison industry enhancement programs. And in those cases, the prisoners are being paid generally about the minimum wage, but being paid the minimum wage and actually keeping it is a different story. But the vast majority of prisoners are being paid very little, if nothing. Some states like Texas and Florida, which are two of the biggest prison systems in the country, they don't even pay. They pay their prisoners nothing. They don't make a pretense of paying their prisoners for their slave labor, which is literally what it is when you force people to work and don't pay them. But even in states that do pay prisoners, as a general rule, they're only being paid pennies an hour, if that, or very small sums.
And how are they getting away with not paying them?
Well, the biggest problem that we have is the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. A lot of people believe that slavery ended with the end of the Civil War and the signing of the 13th and 14th Amendment. But the 13th Amendment did not end slavery. And I think that's a really critical thing to remember is what the 13th Amendment did was it limited slavery to people that had been convicted of a crime. So as one appeals court put it in the 1870s, prisoners are slaves of the state. And I think that's been something that's been taken to heart. And that's one of the things to keep in mind is that anytime prisoners have gone to court seeking any type of compensation, saying they're entitled to pay for their work, the courts just come back with, well, you're slaves of the state. The 13th Amendment allows you to be enslaved. So at the crux of the matter, our Constitution is a problem, and our Constitution is what allows for slavery and the enslavement of people in prison that have been convicted of a crime.
I mean, some might argue, why should prisoners sit with idle hands when the rest of us have to work? Are these low to no wages paid to our incarcerated workers a sort of compensation, perhaps, for the cost of room and board?
Well, yes and no. I think that one of the bigger things is when people on the outside ask why should we be concerned about prison slavery and prison jobs, is because one of the things is what these jobs do is they take jobs away from people outside of prison, and it has a depressing effect on the wages of all workers. In other words, we see this a lot, for example, when you see, especially like at the county level, where sometimes these city officials or county officials will brag that using quote free paid slave labor is saving taxpayers all this money because they have prisoners picking up litter or doing painting projects and things like that. I guess that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is these are jobs that would need to be done, and they would otherwise be done by members of the community who would be paid a good wage to do that. So I think that's kind of one of the things that doesn't get discussed too much. And the other thing too is the whole notion of, as far as the so-called offset. I mean, at the end of the day, slavery is slavery. That's the exact same argument that slave owners used 150 years ago, is that by making slaves work and not paying them, they were offsetting the cost of their room and board for the slave owner. So the only difference is that the slave owner today is the government instead of a private individual or corporation.
And another way to look at it also is a lot of these inmates are going to be released out to the public eventually. Can prison labor have rehabilitative benefits and arm inmates with skills for life on the outside?
Well, that's one of the things that's interesting is that prison officials often try to justify their slave plantations and the slavery that they engage in by using the rehabilitation argument. But what's interesting is that when you look at like manufacturing jobs and you go to prisons, it's often lifers that are doing these programs that are engaged in these manufacturing projects. And by lifers, these are prisoners that are serving life or very long-term sentences. These aren't the prisoners that are in minimum security prisons and are going to be coming back to the community in a fairly short period of time. And the other thing is there's no real evidence about this. That best prison officials can serve up some self-serving anecdotes, and that, but there's nothing in terms of actual concrete evidence in terms of, well, X number of prisoners went through this program, through this prison labor program where we didn't pay them and we just ruthlessly exploited them. And there's very little, if no, evidence on that. The other thing is the nature of the work that's being done in prisons. For the most part, it's very uh, low end, menial, low skill jobs that, frankly, a lot of the stuff that just doesn't exist outside of the prison context. They've been outsourced to China or third world sweatshops long ago. And if they are being done here in the United States, it's often being done by undocumented immigrants. And that's part of the thing is um, you can't really show any examples where prisoners are getting out of prison and even going to work for these same companies that might exploit their labor while they're in prison, being paid a pittance. But for the most part, the jobs just aren't there. They don't exist.
So it's usually low grade jobs that a lot of Americans would probably deem inhumane. Now, do you think these companies like Victoria's Secret, who use these inmates to perhaps sew bras together, or Verizon, who uses inmates in their call centers, would those companies actually hire any of these prisoners on the outside?
That's part of the irony is generally I'm not aware that any of these companies that use prison slave labor on the inside actually employ people when they're released from prison, or if they even employ people that have been convicted of a felony or that have been convicted of a crime. Or at least there's certainly no type of job program where they're seeking out or seeking to employ these prisoners. And I think at the end of the day, it's strictly an economic thing. These companies use prisoners because their labor is cheap, and they're cheap because they don't have to pay them the minimum wage, or they can pay below market wages. And I think that's one of the big things is companies like Victoria's Secret, Verizon, or whatever. These companies are in business to make money. They're not a social welfare program. They're not a welfare agency. Their job is to make money. If they can exploit prison slave labor legally and make money, they will do so. But I've never seen any or heard any indication that these companies are seeking out or wanting to employ released prisoners or prisoners that are available at free world wages or the minimum wage outside of prison.
And speaking of legalities, how regulated are these prison work programs? Do they have unions?
No, and that's one of the things. That's why we go back to the slavery thing, is that prison slave workers are not allowed to unionize any more than plantation slaves were allowed to unionize 150 years ago in this country. Is it's They're not allowed to unionize. They're not allowed to have an organized voice. That said, right now there are some prisoner movements in Texas and Alabama and a few other states that have been organizing prisoner workers to go on strikes and to withhold their labor until their conditions of confinement improve. And I think that's kind of a different thing. But as far as being allowed to legally organize in a union and say, we're not going to work until we're paid or until our conditions improve, that's strictly forbidden. It's very harshly punished. Pretty much, it's interesting is that if you talk to prison officials around the country, they view work stoppages or refusal to work by prisoners as serious of an internal offense as murder or hostage taking or things that very obviously seem like a crime or a serious threat. And I would say that from a prison official's view, any type of refusal by prisoners to be enslaved and to work for no or little pay is viewed as one of the most tantamount dangers to the prison system from their perspective.
I was going to say, I assume a lot of these prisoners would not want to strike or stand up to that because they would fear that it would affect perhaps their sentence and force them to be there even longer.
Yes, and not just that, but we've had a lot of reports of prisoners. They get placed in solitary confinement. They're often beaten and physically abused. One of the things a couple years ago, the Alabama reinstituted a program of chain gangs, and prisoners who refused to work on these chain gangs, which was literally being chained to other prisoners and being forced to do menial labor like grass removal and stuff like that with other prisoners alongside the roads. If they refused, they were chained to an iron rail alongside the highway in the blazing sun with no access to food, no access to water or to bathrooms. And it took the U.S. Supreme Court to say that this was unconstitutional. The lower court said it was perfectly fine to punish prisoners who refused to work for free under these conditions until they did it. So basically, there's high levels of coercive behavior going on to enforce this regimen of prison slavery. And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. American slave plantations 150 years ago, if people say, well, gosh, why didn't the slaves work? And it's usually because, well, if they didn't, they were very harshly punished. And that's very much the same case in American prisons today. At the end of the day, slavery it's a very brutal system, and that's what it runs on is brutality.
And today, the United States actually has more people in prison than there were slaves.
Exactly. And I think that one of the things, too, to keep in mind is that one of the things that's really important to think about is that, yes, the prisoners that are working for these companies and for prison industries are being paid nothing or very little for their labor is an important issue. But you can also say that a very important issue of the 2.5 million people that are locked up today is the fact that they're not working at all, is they've been effectively removed from the American labor markets. So they're not available to work. And then on the other hand, prisons and jails are a vast employment program to the extent that they employ a million people, um, literally as guards, secretaries, and everything else. So on the one hand, you're taking 2.5 million people out of the labor market, then allowing a couple of thousand or tens of thousands of them to work for slave wages, and then on the other hand, you've got this vast workforce of government employees employed to watch over the unemployed, so to speak.
Lots of challenges facing the inmates in our American prison systems. Paul Wright, thanks so much for coming on with us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, and I'm with the Human Rights Defense Center and Prison Legal News at prisonlegalnews.org.